It is Tuesday, October 14th, 1924, and in Lower Manhattan, the clerks are taking orders on a bond. Its name is dull and administrative, the German external loan of 1924. 7% gold bonds dated October 15th, due in 1949. $200 million in total, of which $110 million is allotted to the United States. The syndicate offering it to the American public is headed by J.P. Morgan, Kuhn Loeb, the First National Bank, and the National City Company. And beneath those four names sits a selling network of hundreds of banks and bond houses across the country. The issue is oversubscribed. Understand what you're looking at. 6 years earlier, American soldiers were dying in the Argonne to defeat the German army. Now American school teachers and country doctors queue to lend money to Germany. The plan that made it possible came into force on September 1st, 1924. It ended the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr and handed Berlin 800 million gold marks. Its author was an American banker, Charles G. Dawes. The next year, Dawes won the Nobel Peace Prize, and that is where the textbook stops. Enlightened American finance, extending a hand to a defeated enemy. The golden years of Weimar. That is the story as it has always been told. Every part of it is true, and it is the least important part, because those bonds were not finally paid off until October 3rd, 2010. Because the American who chaired the committee that produced the sequel to the Dawes Plan was the chairman of General Electric and a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and out of his plan came a bank in Basel that was still moving. Gold for Hitler's central bank 2 years into the Second World War. Because in 1938, at the request of the German Air Ministry, an American corporation lent 500 tons of a chemical compound to its own German joint venture, and without that compound, high-octane aviation fuel could not be made. Because in 1942, the United States charged one of its largest companies with criminal conspiracy in wartime over its dealings with the chemical cartel that built a factory at Auschwitz. And because, when that case ended, the fines came to about $50,000 across all the defendants, $5,000 apiece for the corporations, $1,000 for the president of Standard Oil. 13 German industrialists were convicted at Nuremberg. Everyone was free within a few years, and one was chairman of Bayer's supervisory board by 1956. Not a single American executive was ever criminally convicted of anything arising out of these dealings. Not one. So how does that happen? How does a war that kills 60 million people end with a reckoning that reaches the men who signed the orders and never the men who signed the checks? It is all on the record in the Bank of England's internal history, in the 1942 Senate patents hearings, in a United States Treasury report of 1945 on the BIS's own website. Here is the full story. Here is the thesis, stated plainly. The engine of this history was money. Not ideology, not hatred, not madness. Those belong to Germany, and Germany owns them. The engine was capital doing what capital does, seeking a return, following a yield, and declining again and again, to look up from the ledger long enough to ask what was being built with it. American money refloated the German economy in the 1920s. American corporations licensed to German industry the technologies of mechanized war, and an American ran the world's most obscure bank while it processed Reichsbank gold. American-owned factories in Germany ran on slave labor, and you were not told not because anyone burned the documents, but because the documents are boring. A gold transfer, a patent pool, a consent decree. The vocabulary of finance is an anesthetic, built to make a catastrophic decision read like paperwork. Let us begin where the money begins. To understand 1924, you have to understand 1923. The German currency had ceased to mean anything. Savings built across a lifetime evaporated in a season. The reparations bill could not be paid, so France and Belgium marched into the Ruhr to take payment in coal and steel. So German production stopped, so the reparations could be paid even less. The system ate itself. The Dawes Plan cut the knot with the only instrument available, American credit. Roughly $1.33 billion of German bonds were floated in the United States in the 7 years after 1924. Estimates of the total American lending vary widely, and I will not pretend to a precision the sources do not support. But American capital refloated Weimar Germany, and the money did not stop at government bonds. That is the sentence the textbook never writes. In 1926, Dillon, Ridd and Company of New York underwrote a $70 million bond issue for Vereinigte Stahlwerke, United Steel Works, the steel trust assembled that year from the Thyssen, Flick, and Phoenix concerns. Wall Street proceeds also helped capitalize a chemical trust called IG Farben, the steel and the chemicals. American investors helped assemble the industrial spine of the country that would invade Poland 13 years later. And nobody in that story is a Nazi. In 1926, the Nazi Party is a fringe movement. That is the point. Nobody had to be a Nazi. The bonds paid 7%. And here's where the story turns, because of what happens next to that money. By 1929, the Dawes arrangement needed replacing. Its successor committee was chaired by Owen D. Young, chairman of General Electric, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and reported from Paris in June 1929. Reparations were fixed at a theoretical total of about 112 billion gold marks, call it $26 billion, cut down from the 132 billion demanded in 1921 and payable over 58 years. The final German payment was scheduled for 1988. Alongside it came a further international loan of $300 million, floated again by J.P. Morgan. That same year, IG Farben incorporated an American holding company in Delaware. Its first president was Hermann Schmitz, Farben's future chief executive. On its board sat Edsel Ford of the Ford Motor Company, Walter Teagle of Standard Oil of New Jersey, Charles Mitchell of National City Bank, and the German Jewish banker Paul Warburg, hold that last name. A great deal of poison has been distilled from it. Then the structure collapsed. The Hoover Moratorium of June 1931 suspended reparations. Lausanne ended them altogether in 1932. From 1933, Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht's transfer moratorium suspended service on the Dawes and Young bonds. The German state did not absorb that loss. American bondholders did. This is where the popular version goes wrong, and the correction makes the truth worse. Adam Tooze of Columbia supplies the essential qualifier. Nazi rearmament after 1933 was financed in large part by defaulting on those American loans, not by receiving new American money. Wall Street did not buy the Reich. Wall Street rebuilt Weimar, and then the men who destroyed Weimar stopped paying and kept the factories. The Young Plan left something behind. Under the Hague Agreements of January 1930, it created an institution to administer German reparations. It opened in Basel on the 17th of May, 1930, the Bank for International Settlements. It is still there. Note one detail, because the internet gets this wrong constantly. The Federal Reserve declined to join. The American seat went to a private banking group led by J.P. Morgan. The BIS's first president, Gates W. McGarrah, had chaired the executive committee of Chase National Bank and the board of the New York Fed. The central bank for central banks had an American at the head of the table, and no American government at all. Now hold that thought, because the story moves to a laboratory. In September 1927, Standard Oil of New Jersey and IG, Farben agreed to develop high-pressure coal hydrogenation together, the process that turns coal into liquid fuel. 2 years later, Farben sold Standard the rights to it everywhere outside Germany for about $35 million paid largely in Standard Oil shares as the Woolheim Memorial at the Fritz Bauer Institute records. The two firms then carved the world into spheres of interest: oil for Standard, chemicals for Farben, the shared patents held in a jointly owned vehicle in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Among those patents was one for synthetic rubber, Buna. Remember the word. In 14 years, it will stop being a chemical and become the name of a factory beside a railway siding in Upper Silesia at a place called Auschwitz. Now the threads converge on a metal. Tetraethyl lead is the anti-knock additive that makes high-octane aviation fuel possible. Without it, in 1938 you do not have a modern Air Force. The Ethyl Gasoline Corporation. Not a Standard subsidiary, but a joint venture of Standard Oil and General Motors and IG Farben together set up a German company, Ethyl G.m.b.H, to build tetraethyl lead plants inside Germany. The War Department in Washington was consulted. It raised no objection. And in 1938, the German Air Ministry needed 500 tons of it. Working through Karl Krauff of IG Farben, the arrangement was made. The Ethyl Export Corporation of New York would lend the 500 tons not to the Air Ministry itself, but to Ethyl G.m.b.H, the German joint venture, at the Air Ministry's request. The security was arranged by a letter dated September 21, 1938, 9 days before the Munich Agreement, through the private bank Brown Brothers Harriman. Shipments began within the month. This is not folklore. It is in the 1942 Senate patents hearings and documented by Joseph Borkin, once chief of the Justice Department's Patent and Cartel section. Then the war begins. And here is the detail that ought to be taught in every business school in America. In September 1939, Poland's armies collapsing, Warsaw still holding out, Britain and France already at war, a vice president of Standard Oil named Frank A. Howard traveled to the neutral Netherlands. On this 22nd of September, at The Hague, he met an IG Farben engineer named Fritz Ringer. The purpose was to move Farben's American patents across to Standard out of reach of seizure as enemy property. In his own report, Howard wrote that they had worked out complete plans for a modus vivendi, which would operate through the term of the war, whether or not the U.S. came in. On the 25th of March, 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Standard Oil of New Jersey and its affiliates pleaded nolo contendere to criminal antitrust conspiracy and signed a consent decree. The fines came to roughly $50,000 across some 10 corporate and individual defendants, $5,000 a company. Standard's president, William S. Farish, was fined $1,000. Nobody went to prison. Assistant Attorney General Thurman Arnold had agreed to drop from the complaint the allegation that Standard held up America's own synthetic rubber program. The day after the decree was signed, he went before the Truman Committee and made it anyway. Standard Oil, he testified, delayed the use of Buna rubber in this country because Hitler's government did not wish to see it exploited here. Historians dispute this. Standard denied intent, and scholars of the oil industry read the delay as a tangle of cartel self-interest, patent restriction, and a preference for butyl rubber over Buna. It was the government's charge, not a settled fact. But the charge landed. The senator from Missouri said Standard Oil of New Jersey had been putting forth every effort to protect the control of the German government over a vital war material, even after America was in the war. Harry Truman used the word treason in open session about the largest oil company on earth. He would be president within 3 years. Standard Oil of New Jersey would become Exxon. But there was another dimension to this, and it was not chemistry. It was vehicles, and a man in Michigan. In 1918, Henry Ford bought a newspaper. From the 22nd of May, 1920, the Dearborn Independent ran a series called The International Jew, The World's Problem, for 91 issues. Ford's publishing house bound it into 4 volumes and pushed 500,000 copies through his dealer network. They were in German by 1922, and the German editions never stopped circulating. In Mein Kampf, the only American Hitler praised by name was Henry Ford. Only a single great man, Ford, he wrote, to their fury, still maintains full independence. And at Nuremberg, Baldur von Schirach, who had run the Hitler Youth, said of Ford's book, "I read it and became anti-Semitic." On the 30th of July, 1938, on his 75th birthday, at a ceremony in Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford was presented with the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Nazi Germany gave a foreigner. He sat for the photographs. He never gave it back. That same year, James D. Mooney, head of General Motors overseas operations, received the Order of Merit of the German Eagle, and in Germany, the machine. By March 1941, Ford Motor Company's stake in Ford-Werke of Cologne had been diluted to 52%. The plant had issued new stock, sold only to Germans, and Dearborn held that majority right through the war. In May 1942, the Superior Court of Cologne placed Ford-Werke under a German custodian, ruling it, in the court's own phrase, under authoritative enemy influence. American-owned, German-run, and staffed from 1941 with forced and slave labor more than 2,000 people at any one time, and by 1943 roughly half the workforce. Poles, Jews, French, Italians, Russians. Elsa Iwanova was 16 when German troops seized her in Rostov-on-Don on the 6th of October 1942. She was put on a train and carried west, across the ruins of her own country, to Wuppertal. It was there that a representative of Ford-Werke came and bought her and 38 other young people, for the plant at Cologne. She spent the war making parts for trucks. On the 8th, 1998, she sued Ford in a federal court in New Jersey. The court dismissed every claim, statute of limitations, non-justiciability, comedy, not on the merits. She recovered nothing. General Motors bought 80% of Adam Opel in 1929 for something like $33 million, and the remaining fifth in 1931. Opel was Germany's largest carmaker. Its Brandenburg plant built the Opel Blitz, the standard 3-ton truck of the Wehrmacht, well over 130,000 of them by 1944. The Rüsselsheim works made components for the Junkers 88 bomber. Both used thousands of forced laborers. GM and Opel have acknowledged it, and in 1939, defending the arrangement, GM's chairman, Alfred P. Sloan wrote that an international business should conduct its operations in strictly business terms, without regard to the political beliefs of its management or the beliefs of the country in which it is operating. There is the logic of this. Entire film in one sentence. Not hatred, neutrality elevated to a principle and applied to a regime that had already built Dachau. Nor was it only Detroit. Sosthenes Bain, president of ITT, was received by Hitler in August 1933, one of the first American businessmen he saw after taking power. Through the Berlin electronics firm C. Lorenz, ITT held roughly a quarter of Focke-Wulf Flugzeugbau, maker of the FW-190, the fighter that killed RAF pilots over the Channel, and now back to Basel, where every thread converges. When war came, the Bank for International Settlements did not close. Its last full board meeting was held in June 1939. In December, it declared neutrality. Its president from 1940 to 1946 was an American, Thomas H. McKittrick, who lived in Basel throughout. On its board sat Walther Funk, Reichsbank president and Hitler's economics minister, Emil Puhl, the Reichsbank's vice president, and Hermann Schmitz of IG Farben. and on March 15, 1939, German troops occupied Prague. Days later, the BIS relayed an instruction to move gold worth £5.6 million, around 23 tons, out of the account it held at the Bank of England for the Czechoslovak National Bank, into the account it held for the German. Reichsbank. Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, executed it. He did not consult the Treasury. This is not an allegation. It is in the Bank of England's own internal war history released in 2013. Albrecht Richlull, professor of economic history at the London School of Economics, told CNN when the papers came out that the bank had done this in cold blood and pretending not to know what these accounts were and where the gold was coming from. The BIS's own history calls it the most controversial action the bank ever took, and concedes the check instruction was given under duress. And by the BIS's own itemized accounting, it received 3,738 kilograms of gold from the Reichsbank, looted from 3 central banks, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy. Under the Washington Agreement of May 1948, it handed 3,740 kilograms to the Allied Tripartite Commission for the restitution of monetary gold on the 24th of June 1948. 9 years and 3 months after Prague, and now a bank you have heard of. Chase National Bank kept its Paris branch open through the German occupation under a manager named Carlos Niedermann. A United States Treasury report of April 1945 concluded that the record of the Paris branch is one of uncalled-for responsiveness to the desires of the Germans. The same report described Niedermann as very vigorous in enforcing restrictions against Jewish property, even going so far as to refuse to release funds belonging to Jews in anticipation that a decree prohibiting such release might be published by the occupying Nazi authorities. He was freezing Jewish accounts ahead of the law, in case the law arrived later. Chase later acknowledged that its Paris branch blocked roughly 100 accounts, the bank's own estimate, and in 1998, Chase said it intended to compensate Jewish account holders whose assets had been illegally plundered. It settled with the World Jewish Congress in May 1999. And between 1936 and 1941, Chase National and other American institutions sold Rookwanderer marks, discounted, blocked German currency, marketed to Americans of German descent, earning the Reich dollars. The pool those marks came out of included assets stripped from Jews who had fled Germany. The historian Richard Breitman and his colleagues reconstructed the scheme from the National Archives. The FBI opened an investigation in October 1940. A grand jury convened in August 1941. No Chase executive was prosecuted. Chase's counsel had threatened to expose FBI, Army, and Navy sources and methods in open court. Now the reckoning, or rather its absence. In July 1944 at Bretton Woods, the conference that designed the post-war financial order resolved to abolish the bank for international settlements at the earliest possible moment. It never happened. European central bankers lobbied to keep the bank. By 1948, liquidation was abandoned. The BIS operates in Basel today. Thomas McKittrick left its presidency in 1946 and walked straight into a senior vice presidency at Chase National Bank. No officer of the BIS was ever prosecuted. At Nuremberg in the United States versus Karl Krausch and others, 23 executives of IG Farben stood trial from August 1947 to July 1948. Chief Prosecutor Telford Taylor told the tribunal that the indictment accuses them of wholesale enslavement, plunder, and murder. 13 were convicted, 10 were acquitted outright. The longest sentences, 8 years, went to Otto Ambros, who ran production at the Buna, works at Auschwitz, and Walter Dürfeld, who ran its construction. Fritz Termeer got 7. Farben's chief executive, Hermann Schmitz, the man from the BIS board, got 4. Judge Paul M. Hebert dissented. Willing cooperation with the slave labor utilization of the Third Reich was a matter of corporate policy that permeated the whole Farben organization. Under the clemency program of the American High Commissioner, John J. McCloy, every convicted Farben executive was out of prison by early 1951. Fritz Termeer, convicted of plunder and of slavery, became chairman of Bayer's supervisory board in 1956, and held it until 1964. Otto Ambros, released after roughly 3 of his 8 years, advised Chancellor Adenauer, sat on the board of Chemie Grunenthal while it marketed thalidomide, and consulted for Dow and for the United States Army Chemical Corps. One man broke through. Norbert Wollheim, who had survived Monowitz, sued IG Farben in liquidation in the Frankfurt Regional Court in November 1951. In June 1953, the court found for him and ordered Farben to pay 10,000 marks. Farben appealed. In February 1957, a settlement with Wollheim and the Claims Conference produced 30 million marks for every forced laborer of Auschwitz-Monowitz and its subcamps. Now count the ledger. 13 German industrialists convicted, all free within about 3 years. Not one American executive of Standard Oil, Ford, General Motors, ITT, Chase National, or Brown Brothers Harriman convicted of anything. The whole American criminal penalty on record is that consent decree about $50,000 in antitrust fines, split across 10 defendants, in a country then spending more than that on the war every few seconds. I want to be careful here, because this is a topic where conspiracy theories flourish. The crude version of this story is not merely wrong, it is a forgery with a name and a date. In 1933, an Amsterdam publisher issued a book presented as the confession of a New York banker named Sidney Warburg, who claimed to have carried millions of dollars to Hitler on Wall Street's behalf. There was no Sidney Warburg. James P. Warburg swore an affidavit. No such person as Sidney Warburg existed in New York City in 1933, nor elsewhere then or at any other time. Reprinted after the war, the forgery was laundered into Anthony Sutton's 1976 volume. That is, the taproot of "the bankers funded Hitler," a phrase in which the bankers, after a century of propaganda, has always meant Jewish bankers. The trope is not merely false, it is inverted. Kuhn Loeb underwrote the bonds of a democratic republic 5 years before the Nazis were a mass party. That republic was then destroyed by men who expropriated German Jewish banks. Warburg was Aryanized in 1938. Max Warburg fled. Jewish bankers were the regime's victims and its revenue source, never its patrons. Sutton's documents are often real. His conclusion is rejected by the historians who worked the German sources. Henry Ashby Turner found that Hitler's rise did not depend on big business money. And Prescott Bush did not fund Hitler. He held one share of Union Banking Corporation for a Dutch bank tied to Fritz Thyssen, and Washington's seizure of the firm under the Trading with the Enemy Act in October 1942 was a custody measure, not a criminal finding. The Anti-Defamation League says flatly that he was neither a Nazi nor a Nazi sympathizer, and most important, complicity is not shared authorship of genocide. The Holocaust was conceived, ordered, and carried out by the German state. Nothing here makes Standard Oil or Chase or Ford a co-author of the final solution. How far Detroit still controlled its German plants after 1940 is argued to this day. Turner worked from records General Motors opened to him but took none of its money. Ford commissioned Simon Reich's report. Say what the documents say. The documents are enough. The villain of this story is not a cabal. Every name in it, Owen Young, Walter Teagle, Frank Howard, Alfred Sloan, Henry Ford, Sosthenes Bain, Montague Norman, Thomas McKittrick, John McCloy, belong to the Protestant establishment of the English-speaking world. They did not meet in cellars. They met in boardrooms, and they published minutes. What protected them was never secrecy. It was normalcy, the power of commercial language to make a monstrous decision read as a routine one. A loan is a loan. A gold transfer is a gold transfer, even when the gold was taken at gunpoint from the central bank of a country that no longer exists. And the institution is built to house that logic. A corporation has a fiduciary duty. It has no memory, no conscience, no capacity for shame. It is an engine for converting the moral into the procedural. Sloan said the quiet part in 1939 and did not think he was confessing. And when it was over, the men who had built the financial architecture of the war were the men available to build the architecture of the peace. Germany had to be rebuilt against Moscow. The chemists were needed. The bankers were needed. The thread was never pulled. Understand what that teaches. A legal system will reliably punish the man who fires the rifle, and reliably fail to punish the man who financed the factory that made it, because the second man's crime has no scene, no weapon, no moment. The distance between capital and consequence is the most durable form of impunity ever devised. Not immunity, distance, and we are still inside it. Every time a bank moves money for a regime that tortures people, and the fine is smaller than a quarter's profit, and no individual is charged, that is this story. In 2000, the German Bundestag created the foundation Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future. It paid about 4.4 billion euros to 1.66 million surviving forced laborers, a few thousand euros each, 60 years late, for a stolen life. The buildings are still standing. The Bank for International Settlements still meets in Basel. Bayer is still Bayer, and the ledger that recorded all of it was never a secret. It was simply never read. So here's what I want from you in the comments. Of all of them, Standard Oil, Chase National, Ford, General Motors, ITT, the Bank of England, the Bank for International Settlements, which one should have stood in the dock at Nuremberg, and what would the century have looked like if it had? I read every comment, and the arguments most carefully of all. If this is the kind of history you come here for, documented, sourced, uncomfortable, subscribe. There are a great many chapters missing from the textbooks, and we intend to go through them one at a time. I'll see you in the next one.